Okay, so let's look at this question of whether there is a mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim, and if so, how do you fulfill it for someone who is sick with a contagious disease, shall we say? Okay, here. So let's start with. This is, I think, this should be Rav Asher Weiss. Yes, this is the first position. This is the more the Gavi position, which is probably the one I agree with as well. Okay? So this is from the Piskei Rav Asher Weiss on Bikkur Cholim. So let's take his summary. Okay. Gavi, why don't you read his summary?
In the Vakar Shanimsa Bidur of Benagir.
Good, that's the summary of his position. What does that mean?
You cannot visit a sick person who is in quarantine or who is sick with plague, I guess, would be how you say it.
Right, with the virus, right? Now, you say this like it's obvious, but as you see, there is a long footnote here. And the reason there's a long footnote is because there is one very major source that he has to deal with who seems to say not that way. And that the source that seems to not say that way is a person named Rav Moshe Isserlis, who is a important posek, also known by his acronym, which is the acronym being
The Rama.
Yeah, thank you, the Rama, right? The Rama. And if you look at the tshuva, I'll look at his footnote in a minute. Here's the Rama. The Rama writes this: Sof davar, eini roeh klal shu chal maskir, etc. Here, you want to read this paragraph? Take it, Gavi. This is the tshuva Rama Siman Chaf.
Sof davar eini roeh klal שיוכל מזכיר זה לומר הדתה דהכי לא הזכרתי.
Okay, so he's talking about a different case, right? He's really, there's in the middle of a Choshen Mishpat question on renters. So let's, right, even if it's true that the renter got sick, his wife got sick, fine. Okay, let's skip to what he says in the middle. Though he says, Kimasha Omer, Shehu Choli Midabek. Yeah?
Kimasha Omer, Shehu Choli Midabek, Kulo Hata.
And that's what you said.
Right? Terminally sick, then everything.
No, so Choli Midabek is it's infectious. Right? It's infectious, you can catch it, and that should be a reason for him to get out of this contract. It's wrong. It's only because you're worried. Why? Ki Hashem yitaleh. Right, God is the one who makes you sick and heals you. And this is where he goes off on this tangent, and he says, and if you were right, and again, I don't want to get into the Choshen Mishpat thing, all the laws of Bikkur Cholim would disappear. Ki lo matzinu b'shum makom shechilku ben choli midabek l'she'enu midabek. Because in no places do we find a difference between an infectious disease and a non-infectious disease, ... So the simple pshat of the Rama is, are you chayev? Is the mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim even in someone who has an infectious disease?
What is this?
Oh, good. Gavi's, what is this? Good. So I'm going to let you read Rav Asher. I'm going to let you be Rav Asher. And Rav Asher is going to say exactly what Gavi said, which is, it can't be what it sounds like. Really? Like you're going to tell someone he has to put their life in danger to visit someone with an infectious disease? Good. So look at footnote 18. Here. Go ahead, Gavi.
B'shir harama siman chaf katav kach.
Right, so he quotes the Rama. Right, Right here. Okay, so here's the quote, so let's pick up from his summary. Umuvuar. Right here.
ומבואר שיש מצוות ביקור חולים בחולי מדבק חוץ מחולי רעתן.
Right? So there's a mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim except for this particular disease.
Gemara b'kuva avodas
Ayin Zayin Amud Beis.
Ayin Zayin Amud Beis. Ita Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi mevarech ba'alei ratan v'asik b'tara.
Okay. VeKosher Sham Katav. Yeah.
שבשאר מצוות אסור ללך אחד, לשכיח הזקה חוץ מיתת
Talmud Torah, Yuyan Sham, right? So the Kavod makes it sound like you can't go to perform it so where it's likely that you'll get damaged, except maybe Talmud Torah. Okay, hold that for a moment. But here's what Rav Asher Weiss says about the Ramah, because he has the same reaction that Gabi does. What do you mean? Really? Someone has Ebola and it's a mitzvah to go visit them? Right? That doesn't make any sense. So what does he say?
Right.
Okay, so what does he say?
That it's clear that the kavanah of the Ramah is that he's not talking about something that's he's only talking about something that's not infectious.
No,
or that's
he said clearly infectious. It's not b'ofen charig v'kitzonei. It's not extremely infectious. Or he says the Ramah must mean something that's like easy to not be infected, right? Like, it's technically infectious, but it's not so infectious, right? You could easily avoid getting sick. I don't know what he's imagining, but okay, right? Aval.
Yeah, something that you can control, maybe? I don't know.
Right, I don't know, right? Maybe it's infectious, but only if you come into contact with blood, right? So you can, or whatever, right? Or, or something that, I don't know, pick a disease. I'm not sure exactly what he means. But Rav Asher isn't willing to accept the simple implication of the Ramah. Right? And therefore he says, Aval machala zo shemadbeket bekalut v'kasher l'shod mechazajam shanguim b'machala v'lo lidabek. But this disease, which is very easily caught, right? It's very infectious and it's very hard to say that you will not get sick. Ein mitzvah levaker cholim. Okay. Here, continue, Gabi.
אבל מחלה זו שמדבקת בקלות וקשה לשהות במחיצתם של הנגועים במחלה ולא להידבק. This disease that is easily contagious and is difficult to protect or to separate the sick people without spreading, without infecting others. In mitzvah levaker cholim, there's no mitzvah to visit them.
Good. Right, and then he says,
ויש שציינו לדברי הרמב"ן על התורה, פרשת וירא, שכתב
וזה לשונו.
עוד בו עניין כי הראות באוויר הדבר ובכל החוליים הנדבקים יזיק מאוד. וידביקם וכן המחשבה בהם וכולי. ולכן הייתה אשתו שאלות נציב מלך כי ואתה המכה במחשבתה כאשר ראתה גופית והמלך הירד עליהן מן השמיים ודווקא בה.
Right, so the Ramban has this interesting claim that things are very, very diseases can be very, very infectious, And he has this idea that that's actually what happened to the wife of Lot, right? That somehow she caught the plague of Sodom, right? And that's what happened. Okay. Now, part of Rasher's argument that the Ramah can't literally have meant that no matter how infectious the disease is, you're chayiv in Bikkur Cholim, is what the footnote of the Ramah, in the Tshuvas Ramah notes. The Uveharot al Shur Ramah sham katav sham chav tziyin sheRamah atzmo barach miKrakow l'shidlo b'shat shintet zayin. V'sham chiber b'rishol Megillat Esther b'shem mechir yayin b'derech pardes v'shalchu laviv mishloch manot. Right, and if I might have mentioned this to some of you, right? That the Ramah himself writes in his Hakdama. I love this Hakdama, the Hakdama to his Sefer on Megillat Esther, Mechir Yayin, that the reason he wrote the Sefer was because there was a plague of cholera, and they couldn't celebrate Purim, and he was so depressed that he turned to the one thing that made him happy in life, which was Torah. So because he couldn't celebrate Purim, he wrote a Sefer on Megillat Esther. That was his consolation prize for that Purim in quarantine. So in that Sefer he writes, Va'ani Moshe ben Kavod Abba Mari HaParnes V'Maneg Yisrael Shalit Anikra Moshe Isserlis miKrakow. Right, me, the Ramah. Hayiti b'toch haGolah shenitgalenu mi'ireinu b'shnat shin Yudvav Machman Ipusha Avir lo aleinu. Right, I was in Galut because of Ipusha Avir. There was this mold, this disease in the air. And I moved to Shidlov during this epidemic. He quotes the Ma'ariel, who says that when God is angry and people are getting sick, it's a good thing to run away. Before it spreads, right, who had a student who left Venice. Bitul, who asked whether he has to pay his tutor when he fled the city because of a disease. Umasik the patur Omer ben Ashar he says in the context of his monetary argument, he says, look, if you flee because of a disease, that's ones, that's an unavoidable accident. Bevadai de hayari v'rachal evav u'mesukan be'ed davar. I'm not sure. Right, those who are afraid and are in danger. Right, no one thinks you have to make this disease, etc. And therefore, you can't say that you should have made a condition in your original contract that I hire you as my teacher as long as there's not an epidemic. No one took that into account. So Rav Asher Weiss basically has Gavi's intuition, which is, look, even if the Ramah says that the mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim is even for people who are contagious, he can't really mean it. Maybe it's mildly contagious, but easy to control, but no one can tell you, right? The Ramah himself ran away from disease. Obviously, just run away from disease. Don't go visit the person in the hospital in the corona ward, right? Don't do that, okay? I tend to think that it's obvious that we should paskin that way, but I would be lying if I said that was the only position. So, if you look in this tshuva here, okay, in the same sefer, on Havayani Chadarav, so on page 319, Rav Mordechai Gross writes a short tshuva on it, and he says as follows: Mi shenidbak b'magefa b'din b'mitzvat Bikkur Cholim elav. Someone who has corona. What's the halacha in terms of Bikkur Cholim? He says, Hine me'ikara dedina ika Bikkur Cholim. He thinks that me'ikara din, from the strict letter of the law, there's a mitzvah to visit the sick. Af she'achol dabek. Even though he could get sick, because the danger isn't so great. Because in Eretz Yisrael, I assume what he means is that the death rate was very, very low in Israel, right? Particularly low compared to the rest of the world, right? Even with now 130,000 cases, right? We still have less than a 1% death rate. I assume that's what he's getting at. V'af ba'alma have a mu'at be'achuzav. right? And he says even, right, in the rest of the world, the percentage is low. Right, nefesh, and he says definitely for young people it doesn't seem to be dangerous. And the Ramah makes it sound like there is a mitzvah Bikkur Cholim except for the one disease of Ra'atan. But even he limits the Ramah, and he says, look, I agree, essentially, with what we saw from Rav Asher Weiss, that the Ramah can't mean every disease. But he makes a distinction differently than Rav Asher. Rav Asher says the difference is between real pikuach nefesh and things which are not really going to put your life in danger. Sorry. Rav Asher Weiss makes the difference between something which is very, very contagious and things which are not so contagious. Based on that, corona is pretty contagious. So Rav Asher Weiss says there's no mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim with someone who has corona. But at this stage in the tshuva, Rav Mordechai Gross wants to say that maybe this is different because maybe the standard of the Ramah isn't how contagious something is, but how dangerous is it really to you? And he says if the death rate is really less than 1% or whatever it is, so maybe you might think that the mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim applies. So that is his Hava Amina. But don't worry, Gavi, he's not going to really go through with that, right? So far we have a theoretical model, but then he says, Amnam, but he notes that there are many Achronim that followed Rav Asher Weiss and saying that can't be what the Ramah means. So he says, Amnam, B'shulchan Gavoa Yeradeh Sin Shin Laman Gimel Lo Nir Shevin came Brahma. V'ayim Nishmat Kol Chai, Shevet HaLevi, Ateret Paz, Divrei Yatziv, Sefer Ashrei Maskil, Hilchot Bikkur Cholim, etc. Al Kol Panim, Im Yilamed Torah Zechol Muftach Lo Shidbak. Then he says something which I find really shocking. But again, I'm giving you two views. I will tell you in advance. I would paskin like Rav Asher Weiss, but I want to give you the view because I didn't know it until I read it in this book just now. He says, but I think that if you go and learn Torah with the sick person, that's a segula that you won't get sick. And therefore it's fine. Based on Kol Machal Asher Samti V'Shem Lo Sim Alecha Keneshem Revechal Mash Medrav Shkol Echad Muftach B'Limud HaTorah Kain V'Lo Rak Yeshu Ben Levi L'Fum Gudulato Shlem Uto BaTorah. So therefore he thinks, based on that the sugya, that you have a solution. You should go and learn Torah with him. And then you'll have a schut. Amnam. Kevan shlo yitkarvu lachaleb and give zela b'merchak v'gam bazem matzil sheyeh chavush befiv yeshno ken v'kayim bazem mitzvah Bikkur Cholim. But then he said something which I still don't know if I would paskin this way, but at least I find more reasonable. Because what he just said, which is, yes, just go visit someone with corona as long as you learn Torah, you won't get sick, I find that to be very dangerous. I think Gavi would agree with me. Gavi, I think you would back me up, and that's a dangerous psak.
I mean, my camera is off, but if it were on, you would see me cringing. I'm sure
I would. I'm imagining your face. But then he says something which, okay, maybe I could accept it. And he says, but look, that doesn't mean you have to be stupid. And since we know that you can basically effectively protect yourself with corona by keeping distance and wearing a mask, so he says, so maybe what you should just do is you should visit them from afar, right? So that already I hear, right? You want to say, something's going on with my microphone, but you want to say that you could, go at a distance, right? Like wave at the person next through the window with a mask. Okay, that I think is already reasonable, right? Meaning, if you want to formally say there's a mitzvah Bikkur Cholim, so find a way to do it that's safe. Okay, I'm willing to hear that. And then he says that, and this is a big machloket, but then he says, and if you don't want to do that, so then you should rely on the positions that you can be Mekayim Bikkur Cholim by telephone. Well, he says, if they won't agree, or if you can't do that, so then at least do something and pick up the phone. And he says, but maybe the Magifa is different. And because a Magefa doesn't distinguish between tzaddikim, Efshar Magefa Chamira B'cholza. And he said, maybe it's not true. Maybe it's only a regular disease. But an epidemic, where it doesn't distinguish how good of a person you are, and God's wrath is on the world, so maybe there you would say, no, it really is dangerous for you, even if you're going to go, even if you're going to learn Torah, Ulay Unam Mitzvah Bikkur Cholim, Umitzvah Limud Torah, etc. V'yesh la'ayin b'shar idan ritcha da'idan b'bercha refainu afshar laskir shem shabrim shlo yachalu chas v'shalom. And then he has this little thing at the end, and he thinks, can you daven for people to not become sick? He thinks, don't mention people's names in Rifa'inu to not become sick, because it's about sick people, that you could put in Shema Kolenu. Okay, interesting. Okay, so what do we have? So you have this enigmatic Ramah, who says the Bikkur Cholim does apply even with a contagious disease. No one is willing to really take that at face value. The question is, what is the limitation? Rav Asher Weiss says the difference is something that's a little bit contagious, but you can basically prevent yourself from getting sick, and something which is very contagious. Based on that standard, Rav Asher Weiss says it is obvious to me that you should not, under any circumstances, go and visit someone who is sick with corona. A reasonable psak. Rav Mordechai Gross suggests that maybe the standard of the Ramah is mamish pikuach nevesh versus not. Now this is his havamina. Based on this, he says that what? Because corona has less than a 1% death rate, so maybe the Ramah would tell you you're chayev. That's what he wants to say. But he ends up rejecting that lamaisa and saying, no, most people don't understand the Ramah that way. Possibility 2, he says, is go, but learn Torah with him. And that segula will protect you. I can't buy that one. Right? I can't buy possibility 1 or 2. Possibility 3 and 4, I'm willing to listen here. Which is, what's possibility 3? Find a way that's safe. Keep distance and wear a mask. Right? So that I could hear. Right? I could hear somebody saying, right? I'll go from outside the room and I'll wear a mask. Right? That already... Right? Okay, right? If someone's in their backyard, right? And they'll stand on one side of the backyard, and you'll stand, outside in the front yard, the way I did to say hello to you guys in Bidud, right? I stood on the street, and you stood up on your, on your porch, and I put on a mask, and I kept 50 feet distance. So that I'm already willing to hear, right? Because his third answer is, look, if it's possible to do it safely, so then you should try to do it safely, because it'll add to the, you'll help the chola. That already I'm willing to hear. Right? I hear that. The fourth thing he says, and this is what Rav Asher says in his maskana, is there's a big machlokes amongst the poskim whether in fact you fulfill the mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim by phone or by Zoom. And there are some people who say yes, some people who say no. In general, the consensus of poskim is that you fulfill something. It might not be as good as regular Bikkur Cholim, but you fulfill something. And the reason is because they say Bikkur Cholim has 3 parts to it. One is that you need to, part of Bikkur Cholim is physically helping the chola. That's hard to do by phone. Right? It's hard to do by phone. Part of it is that Bikkur Cholim is supposed to spur you on to daven for the chola. That can happen even if you connect to the chola by phone. And part of Bikkur Cholim is also spiritually, the Gemara says that if you visit a chola, you take away some of their illness, whatever that means. That doesn't seem to happen by phone. Don't ask me why. Right? I don't know exactly why. So that you wouldn't fulfill. So some of the poskim say, look, the main part of Bikkur Cholim is to encourage you to daven for the chola. If that's the case, you fulfill your full mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim. But most other poskim say you fulfill something. Again, you get some of the value of Bikkur Cholim, but not all of it. And therefore, Mordechai Gross says, look, if you don't want to do it, you don't feel comfortable doing it, I understand that, right? But he says you should do something. And since some poskim say that you fulfill Bikkur Cholim by phone, by Zoom, whatever, you should do that. And if you go back to Rav Asher, in the next line, going back to the psak of Rav Asher that we started with, Rav Asher that's Rav Asher's practical suggestion, which is Nitan l'kayem mitzvat Bikkur Cholim b'telephone over emtzaim digitalim acherim. You can fulfill Bikkur Cholim by phone or by other digital media, and he notes that that's the position of Rav Moshe Feinstein, the Minchas Yitzchak, and others. Okay. So again, let's summarize what we've seen. I think it's a nice little interesting question. If nothing else, because it got Gavi's blood boiling. Because, not everyone shares our assumptions. I'm sure that, Gavi, I'm with you. Lamaisa, I would say Paskin like Rav Asher, okay? But you see that, right, it's not obvious. Even if that's how you should Paskin, right, you at least have contend with it. So, again, the Ramah that everyone's dealing with, the Ramah says Bikkur Cholim applies even to someone with an infectious disease. Everyone wants to limit that in some way. Rav Mordechai Gross says he wants to limit it by saying Mamish Pikuach Nefesh versus not Pikuach Nefesh. Based on that distinction, he says there could be a difference, because for most young people, Corona is really not Pikuach Nefesh, and therefore he thinks you could entertain the possibility there's a mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim. He notes, however, that's the minority view. Right? A lot of the poskim go more in the Rav Asher direction, which is no. If something's really infectious, you don't go. The Ramah is talking low-level infection. If that's the case, there's no obligation. Then he suggests this Segula view, which is as long as you go and learn Torah, you'll be fine. But even he's not comfortable with that, because he says, maybe that's not true during an epidemic, a pandemic. I tend to agree. No. You can't just go into an infectious disease, right? Don't go into the Corona ward just because you're learning Torah. I think that's a very bad idea. The practical suggestions at the end that he says, I think, are much more reasonable, right? Either what Rav Asher suggests is just do Bikkur Cholim by phone, which is either a full fulfillment of Bikkur Cholim or at least a partial fulfillment of Bikkur Cholim, or what I think is not completely unreasonable, which is the second to last suggestion of this Rav Moshe Gross, which is, look, because we have a basic idea that coronavirus cannot be spread at a distance, if you're wearing a mask and you're keeping proper distance, so if you really want to fulfill the mitzvah, because you think fundamentally there's still a mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim, it's not completely waived just because someone has an infectious disease, so then you should at least, right, meaning his point is that he thinks fundamentally, again, which I don't agree with, that there's a mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim even with an infectious disease. But he says, look, even he's not going to tell you that you have to put yourself in unnecessary danger. So even he, at the end of the day, says, look, if there's an easy way to make you not in danger, so then you should do both. Keep yourself 100% safe naturally, and be Mekayim Bikkur Cholim. And again, with Corona, you can imagine cases like this. Again, someone will stay in their backyard, right, all the way at the back of their backyard, and you'll stand 50 feet away with a mask, right? And they'll wear a mask, whatever, come up with whatever you want, right? At that point, the danger is infinitesimal. So that I'm willing to accept. So again, fundamentally, I tend to agree with the Rosh Weiss, right? There is no mitzvah, and you should not be putting yourself in going into the room with someone with an infectious disease, to be Mekayim Bikkur Cholim. Whatever the Rambam means, he can't mean that. Or if he does, we don't paskin that way. But I don't think it's completely crazy to say that if you can come up with a way that'll be safe, so then you can do that. And definitely, if you're not even comfortable with that, which is reasonable, to at least say you should be kayim whatever kiyum of Bikkur Cholim you fulfill by making a phone call to someone who's sick, or Zooming with them, or FaceTiming, or whatever the case may be, that I think is... right, that is definitely reasonable. And if you go farther, what I showed you is only the psakim of Rav Asher Weiss. But the truth is that if you go later in his Tshuvot, he also deals with this as well. And he quotes the Ramah, and he knows that the Ramah himself doesn't seem to paskin this way, because that was what we saw before, and therefore here he gives a little bit more of an expansive explanation of the Ramah. So if you look here, he says, here's his suggestion of how to explain the Ramah. One is that maybe the Ramah just meant that in terms of Dinei Mamonot, he was just focusing on Dinei Mamonot Shaila, that it's not enough, having disease is not enough to get rid of your contract, Two was what he said in the Psakim, right? Is that there's a difference between something with very, very little infectious implications and one which is very infectious. And his third possibility, which I think is also reasonable, which is that the Ramah might mean that a disease that you're already immune to, just because it's infectious, you should still, right? If you're already immune, right? You already got the chicken pox, so then you could say you're obligated in Bikkur Cholim, because even though it's contagious, you already got it. So that's his third way of defending the Ramah, is just saying, just because a disease fundamentally is infectious doesn't mean that you are in danger, because you might already have immunity. If you have immunity, so then you can entertain going to visit him. And again, as I've said, my sympathies really here lie with the Rosh Weiss. I can't say that enough, that I don't think you should ever put your life in danger. The only thing I'm willing to accept from Rav Gross's tshuva is that, if you can visit the person in a way that will keep you safe, so then I can understand that you can entertain such a possibility. But fundamentally, I can't accept his notion that, you should just go and visit him, or you should learn Torah and that'll keep you safe. I'm not willing to accept that, Lamaisa. But saying that because we know there are ways that you can actually be safe by keeping distance and wearing masks and etc., or at least to say you're not putter and therefore you should rely on the shita that you should make a phone call, that I think is eminently reasonable, right? Even if you think that that's not a full kiyum of Bikkur Cholim, just because you can't fulfill a full mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim doesn't exempt you from any fulfillment of Bikkur Cholim. That I think is obvious. Okay, so those are some of the tshuva that I found on Bikkur Cholim on Corona. Again, I'm just starting to look through this fascinating book of collecting different people's positions. Again, for the millionth time, if you want my psak, I'm obviously not going to paskin that you should go and get yourself sick. At best, I would tell you make a phone call or visit from a distance with a mask. That's obvious to me that you have to keep yourself safe. However you want to get to that conclusion, I think that's the obvious conclusion. But I do think it's important to realize that just because you might not be able to really visit the person doesn't exempt you entirely, right? If a phone call is going to help and make them feel better, so then you should keep that in mind. That I think is also equally obvious, and that Rav Asher also says. That I think everyone would agree to. Okay, those are some things. I sent you the whole PDF, so if you're, you can see what types of shilas there are. If there's one you want to read together next time, you're free to look through these. Maybe we'll do some more of the Yom Narayim ones. Okay.